Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this talk on Darwin the Geologist, enough rocks to sink the Beagle, his connections with the Geological Survey. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Howe, Principal Curator of the survey, and I'll let him introduce himself. So over to you, Mike. Thanks ever so much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Duncan, and thanks to everybody for coming on this lunchtime to listen to me. Now, while I was off having set this up, having coffee, my forward and backwards arrows have disappeared, and I now see Duncan's screen, I think, on my screen. So something went wrong when Duncan started talking, but let me see. Can people see my screen, Darwin the Geologist?
Yes, I can.
The trouble is I can see your screen too, Duncan, I think. But anyway, let me...
Okay, just let me have a go at what's going on here. Let's just have a look.
I do not appear to be able to control my screen anymore.
Okay, just one moment.
Wait a minute. I've got my arrow. My arrows have come back, so we should be okay, folks.
Well, just we can check, hopefully. That should be all okay. Yeah, I don't know quite what you've done to make your arrows come back, but...
It's the usual right click. Right. Okay, folks, let's see how we go. I hope everyone can see this clearly, full screen. I need to start with a disclaimer that I'm not a professional historian, so some of this I know will lack historian's rigor, but I'm a paleontologist and geologist and curator, and I'm particularly interested, obviously, in the history of Darwin, the Darwin material that we have at BGS, and I'm also a keen fanatic of getting our collections digitized and on the internet so that everybody can enjoy them, so that you don't have to travel to Keyworth or Edinburgh to see our material. And I think over the last 25 years, we have made tremendous progress in this. So I'm going to talk, the main aim of this talk is to address a couple of probably myths about Darwin. One is that he collected so much material that it would have been more than enough to sink the Beagle. And there's also a popular myth that Darwin's numbering system was adopted by the survey, and I'm going to address that in a little bit of detail too. So the contents are roughly on the shown on the screen, and we'll make a start. And I want to really just underline the fact that the last 25 years have seen all sorts, indeed an abundance of bicentenaries, centenaries, anniversaries, and so on, as indeed you will be well aware with the emails that have been going around recently following on from the meeting last year on the 200th anniversary of the description of Megalosaurus. And of course, BGS has some of that material, so we got involved. And this is one of the specimens that we actually had on display, I think, in London. But another, perhaps less well publicized centenary falls within the period of 2007 to 2010, around which there were quite a lot of Darwin celebrations. But just to highlight, 2007, the Geological Society of London's bicentennial. 2009 was the bicentennial of Darwin's birth. Same year was 150 years since he published The Origin of the Species. 2010 was 175 years since the origins of the Geological Survey. And one you may not know of, in 2008 was the centennial of approach by this gentleman to the Geological Survey to try and get our Darwin specimens back. So that gentleman, I don't know if any of you recognize him, that is none other than Thomas McKennie Hughes. Now, Thomas McKennie Hughes was appointed an assistant geologist with the survey in 1861, geologist in 1867, and he resigned in 1873. Now, I've been fortunate in hearing stories from, I think it was a grandniece who spoke to a Friends of the Sedgwick Museum dinner many years ago, saying that she has family archives, passed down, including a letter from Thomas McKennie Hughes to the director of the survey when he was working in the Lake District. And he wrote asking if he could have money for hay so that he could use a horse, and that would enable him to be far more efficient in his survey work. Sadly, the director wrote back to say that, sorry, it was not included in the budget. He couldn't help. He also wrote to the director saying during the winter months, it was too cold to work in his lodgings in the Lake District. Could he come and work in the office in London? He'd be far more efficient if he could use the resources at the time. And again, he was told, I'm sorry, there's insufficient office space. You'll have to stay in your in accommodation up in the Lake District. So I guess it's not too surprising he resigned, and that year was appointed Woodwardian Professor in Cambridge. So in November 1908, he wrote to J.J.H. Teal, who was the director at the time, requesting the return of Darwin's rocks. This is the letter. And it was supported by Alfred Harker and also John Judd, amongst others. So what are we talking about? The collection of Darwin rocks within the survey. Well, any of you can check this. If you go online, if you find the online database, the BGS rock collections, we call it BritRocks, and you can simply put Darwin into the collector donor box and search, and you will get a full list. And there's something like 136, I think it is, specimens in total. And here's the first screen. So they are mostly from Ascension Island. There's also a few from Galapagos. Whoops. Now, whilst the survey certainly has a collection, if it's fairly simple to search around, and you will find that there's a very large collection in the Sedgwick Museum, Cambridge. So the Sedgwick Museum website told you that when he died, his field notebooks and several thousand, about 4,000 specimens were presented to the Sedgwick Museum. At the same time, many of his zoological specimens either made it to the Natural History Museum or the Zoology Museum in Cambridge. And I believe that there are many of his specimens are actually scattered around the museums in the country. And we'll discuss later, this is because when Darwin brought the material back, he actually did very little of the work himself. He sent it off to the appropriate specialists, and not all of that material came back to a central point. So let's look a little bit more about the Geological Survey and the Museum of Practical Geology. So today we are part of NERC's National Geoscience Data Center. It's part of one of their environmental data centers. And this is the National Geological Repository. It's part of it that deals with the physical samples held by BGS. So if you look at it in context of the geological maps, and you go back over 200 years, we're talking about William Smith and his map that, I quote, changed the world. It really marks the point, certainly in the UK, when geology became an applied science. And the map helped document knowledge of the Earth and to predict where and what you could mine, where and what you could bury and protect, where to build, where to tunnel, and so forth. It was really the start of engineering mining geology. In context, well, the Ordnance Survey was established in 1791, as obviously everyone knows, to map particularly the south of Britain so that be easier to plan to move armies around because at the time there was a threat of a French invasion. In 1831, Murchison lobbied for William Smith to be officially appointed as the geological colour of the Ordnance Survey maps, but apparently at that point he was considered too old and was not appointed. And it took a few years, and then Henry de la Beach, who had private means, though they became more limited, he used his private means to do mapping in Devon and Cornwall, where the good quality maps were available. And to augment his income, he then lobbied the government to fund the work, showing how important it was to map out the minerals to help what was effectively the early days of the Industrial Revolution. By 1837, the Museum of Economic Geology had been established at number 1 Craigs Court, Whitehall, and the aim was to put the gems of the collection on display in an educational context to help explore for the necessary raw materials. This is Sir Henry de la Beach, and his initial survey from 1835 was put on a formal footing in 1845, which set up the Geological Survey as a separate entity with the power to enter upon the land of any owner for the purpose of making a geological survey. And the first maps were those down in Devon and Cornwall. So this museum in Craigs Court, this is off Whitehall. And this is what it looks like today. Now, a colleague of mine was down in London and offered to take some photographs for an earlier version of this talk. And this is the other part of Craigs Court. But while he was taking the photographs, suddenly a couple of, a burly policeman and a policewoman came up with a submachine gun and asked what he was doing. Fortunately, he had got his official identification with him, and he explained that he was taking photographs of the site of the original museum. It turns out that now part of this is the back of the Ministry of Defence. Now, some of the other characters that we're going to mention in passing, Richard Phillips was the first chemist and curator at the Museum of Economic Geology. He was a mineralogist, effectively, by background. Edward Forbes was the first paleontologist. John Salter was subsequently appointed to assist Forbes. And Richard Gibbs was the first official fossil collector with the survey, appointed in 1843, and much more of him later. Thomas Huxley, of course, Darwin's bulldog, was appointed in 1854. And he had the dual role of curator, but he was also professor of natural history in the Royal School of Mines, which is effectively part of the buildings of the Museum of Practical Geology, but more of that in a minute. So the Craigs Court premises, accommodation was very limited. It was restricted to displaying effectively minerals, rocks, and materials made from earth resources. So it included some bricks, tiles, and an Etruscan vase, and actually they started to amass quite a collection of porcelain, which subsequently made it to the V&A. So when the accommodation with pressure increased, they looked around for an alternative site, and they picked one that ran through from Piccadilly to Jermyn Street. It had been tenements, or was tenements at the time. These were demolished, and it proved difficult to get good foundations because there had been cesspits in the base of, I think it was Derby Court. But in 1851, the museum finally opened, and it included both the headquarters of the Geological Survey, the Mining Record Office, and the Government School of Mines and of Science as applied to the arts. In other words, what's now known as the Royal School of Mines, which is part of now Imperial College. So this is where the premises were, 28 to 32 Jermyn Street, not far from where the Geological Society moved to in 1874 at Burlington House. It is now a Waterstones, and the interesting thing is that the premises was used, let's say when the Museum of Practical Geology was demolished, became a departmental store. And it was actually the departmental store that became the model for Are You Being Served, the comedy program on BBC One. But when they moved out, it was taken, it was subsequently become a Waterstones. It's one of their flagship bookstores. But this is what the Museum of Practical Geology looked like, and all the crown jewels were on display. So there were a series of galleries that you could walk around, and they were arranged with the rocks in the basement, rocks and minerals in the basement, and going up through the fossils. And the fossils were divided into two layers. You can probably see some trilobites here. So this was the Paleozoic, and at the top was effectively Mesozoic and Cenozoic. And in fact, in these premises, when Darwin had moved eventually, I'll explain more later, when he was living in Down House, he used to come up and meet his geological contact, Charles Lyell, and many other of his contacts, Huxley and Hooker. And quite often they would actually meet in the galleries at the Geological Museum. And there is on record somewhere his comments that it was nice, peace and quiet, to chat to Huxley and to Lyell. And it's in strong contrast, I must admit, to the Geological Museum and the Natural History Museum, where if Darwin had gone there today to have a quiet chat with Charles Lyell, I think he would find it very difficult to concentrate with his school children screaming and running around. But that was the context from the 1850s. So a little bit more about Charles Darwin and his background. Born in 1809 near Shrewsbury, he started first as a medic at Edinburgh University, but didn't particularly enjoy the practical side, and was admitted to Christ's College, Cambridge, to read the ordinary degree, which would become effectively theological training. In other words, he would go into the clergy. But he met a cousin of his, William Darwin Fox, at Christ College, and he introduced him to Henslow, who gave botany classes, and together they went on a whole series of natural history, entomology collecting around Cambridge. So this is Christ's pretty much as it was in Darwin's time when he was there from 1828 to 1831, sorry. This is the Master's Lodge today. And of course, the college commemorates Darwin now with a bronze statue and some relevant vegetation in a sort of commemorative garden. His rooms used to look like this in 1909 at the previous centenary, and today, if you visit them in Christ, you can have a look round and see what they are, how they've been reconstructed. So in January 1831, he passed his bachelor's, but in order to fulfill the requirements, he had to stay in Cambridge a further 2 terms to do the necessary 3 years. And he filled part of that time in by accompanying Adam Sedgwick, who was professor of geology, who did an annual field trip to Wales. And it was during that time that Darwin learnt the details of fieldwork, field mapping, and collecting. So this is Professor Adam Sedgwick, author of the Cambrian system and the Devonian system, and as I'm sure you know, ended up in controversies with Murchison over where the boundary between Cambrian and Silurian was, which was eventually resolved with the introduction of the proposal of the Ordovician system. But when Darwin got back from Wales, he found a letter from Henslow inviting him to join an expedition on the Beagle. Darwin's father objected, but his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, persuaded the father otherwise, and Darwin set sail. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but I'm sure you're well aware of his trip around the world. And during that trip, he collected, as I say, 4,000 or so rocks, various collections of fossils, and obviously zoological and botanical material. When he returned, he stayed briefly in Cambridge, and shortly afterwards, he was proposed as a Fellow of the Geological Society by Henslow and Adam Sedgwick. And amazingly, in a short time afterwards, was elected to council and became a secretary. In 1837, he then took lodgings in Marber Street in London and moved from Cambridge to London for the next part of his life. In 1839, he married Emma Woodward and started work publishing on his voyage of the Beagle. So the first part of his publications came out in 1839. In 1842, he then moved with his wife to Kent, to Down House, and this can still be visited. It's now maintained by English Heritage. Now, I'm coming back to this later, but I plotted out a whole variety of significant events, both in terms of Darwin, in terms of the museum and the staff, and also in terms of the collections and the collectors. And we'll come back and look at this in more detail shortly. And I need to point out, I'm sure everyone here is well aware, and some very aware, that actually Darwin's works are very easy to study now with a number of websites, including Darwin Online. And it's very easy to get access to all his publications. They're all OCR'd, and his correspondence has been digitized, or most of it, and that's available. It is an absolutely tremendous resource, of which I have really just dipped my toe in so far. So in 1844, he published geological observations on the volcanic islands during the voyage. And this included images, pictures, engravings, effectively, of many of the rock samples. And as I say, you can see alongside each other an OCR text version and the original. And these are some of the specimens that we have in the BGS collections here. So if you look at a typical specimen, you've got the original Darwin label. This is 780. You've also got the BGS number. So we registered it into the survey collections. And this is known as MR 8780. It's museum reserve. So this is one of the specimens that was either on display in the museum or was in reserve for potential display. Now, this always intrigued me because this particular specimen is from Ascension Island, which I know he visited towards the end of his trip. And if he collected about 4,000 specimens, it seems strange that this one, collected towards the end, was only 780. And that was a conundrum which actually the solution became apparent later, and I will explain in a little while. This is another view, again, with our registration number, and this is the label that when it was on display in the Museum of Practical Geology. So how did they actually get to the survey? Well, the answer is, and this is available as a downloadable Google Books. This is the descriptive catalogue of the rock specimens in the Museum of Practical Geology. And if you go through it, you find the section on volcanic rocks from the island of Ascension, presented by Mr. Charles Darwin, FRS, and Captain Ord, RE. So there are detailed explanations of all the specimens that were presented, so that the student going round could actually study in some detail what was displayed. And what I particularly like in this book, every other page was blank, so that as you went round looking at the material, you could even make your own notes. So this is the list that was compiled by Flett of those specimens that actually have Darwin's original numbers, because all we know officially is that it's a collection of 136 samples donated by Captain Ord and Charles Darwin. We don't know, we never had the records as such as those that came from Ord and those that came from Darwin, but those, there are quite a number that actually have Darwin original numbers, and these actually do fill some of the gaps in the original notebook that's preserved in the Sedgwick Museum, Cambridge. So these are the actual proven, let's say, Darwin specimens. There may be others. Darwin's numbering system, as I said, it seems strange that the specimens we knew collected towards the end had such a low number. So looking at the survey, how we organize collections, of course, it's all based around field slips and the actual mapping work of field notebooks in the early days, of course, prior to sort of practical photography. A lot of our geologists would make their detailed field sketches. Now it's just notes on, well, some of them are notes on filofax type pages. And of course, that's now been replaced by digital systems. But in terms of numbering, we now have pre-printed numbers like this, which can easily be dropped into sample bags or stuck on specimens. And the original handwritten collecting sheets are now replaced, obviously, by digital forms of one form or another. And of course, the field laptop or iPad or phone or notebook can be used. But the original system that the survey used for recording specimens was based around these pre-printed books. They ran from 1 up to 5,000, and they had, the interesting thing was that the numbers ran from 401, 402, 403. They went backwards to what you might expect, but that of course was to enable you to start from the edge and cut across, cut in. So that they were reverse printed effectively. And geologists would be allocated a collecting prefix. So this is G for Gibbs, and they would write that in Indian ink ahead of the particular number. So to date, we've got just under 2,000 of these codes, and obviously detailed records of what type of collections, whether they're biostratigraphy or petrology, the range of numbers issued and so forth. Most are straightforward, but there are, of course, a few of the survey collectors, quite a few characters that like to do slightly their own thing. So Etheridge, instead of using a prefix, used a red spot on a lot of his. And quite interesting, I noticed this McKenny Hughes used to, when he finished one book, 5,000 specimens of writing his initials conventionally, and then did another book writing his initials sideways. And that, of course, is fine until you try and put the numbers on computer. So we've had to introduce a whole series of computer prefixes. But Darwin's numbering system, he actually records that he, and this is a really good advice, put a number on every specimen and every fragment of a specimen, and during the very same minute, let it be entered in the catalogue, so that it is hereafter its locality be doubted. The collector may say in good truth, every specimen of mine was ticketed on the spot. But what was more interesting is that he actually used books that just ran up to, they were just a maximum of 3 digits, so up to 999. And he used different colors to indicate the thousands. So I hadn't appreciated initially that ours were actually a very faded yellow. So ours were in the 3000s. So that's fine. That fitted in clearly material collected towards the end of his voyage on the way back. So numbers around about 3,700 would be about what you would expect. But the take-home message from this is don't rely on printing colors, because over time they can easily fade. and yellow in particular is easy to confuse when it's faded and dirty. So looking at this, you can see here is one of our specimens with Darwin's number. You can see the dots that he talked about, so that you can see that this is 806. And actually, if you compare it to the white, you can accept that this is originally a yellow. But I hadn't realized that until I compared it and picked up on Darwin's color system. So these are some of the early survey collections, again, with the initial and the pre-printed numbers. Many of the survey specimens were mounted on blue tablets, and I noticed this is common with other places, certainly including the Sedgwick Museum. And I've heard it said that at the time it was considered under the lighting that blue was a good color to show off typical rocks to good contrast. I'd be interested in any references or any comments people may have perhaps in the discussion afterwards on that. These are typical examples of our register. So these are Gibbs specimens in the 1000s here, collected in these cases in 1859. So that's after some way into his career. The actual numbering system that we use was formally described in a memo by Murchison. This is instructions to the officers engaged in the collection and determination of fossils, issued 15th of November 1858. And he talks about the books of printed numbers formerly employed by the Survey of Great Britain and now adopted in Ireland are to be invariably used for the future, a distinctive letter being assigned to each book when issued with instructions. So that was made absolutely clear. And it really began, the system was used, the earliest we can find on record are 1848. These are Gibbs specimens from North Wales, starting obviously with G1. It's interesting to note that slightly before that, Evelyn in 1847 was sending in parcels of fossils that he collected, no mention of any numbering system at all. So 1848, we seem to have numbers. 1847, no numbers. Here's another example of Evelyn parcels, and I like the certigraphed sketch that's included here. Ramsey, 1848, again, other parcels. This one, there are some numbers, but they don't appear to be official numbers. So if we look in more details, to put these various things into context, Charles Darwin was in London in this period, 1837 to 1842, and on Geological Society Council from 1837 way up to about 1850. This is the Museum of Economic Geology that closed in 1851 with the move to the Museum of Practical Geology. Here, G1, this is the earliest recorded specimen, 1848. And here's Evelyn's parcel that didn't have numbers. What's interesting is here is, yes, Gibbs's employment. So what I'm saying is that certainly at the time the survey introduced the numbering system, Darwin was still regularly in London for Geological Society Council meetings. And it seems quite likely that he would have met up with Dulla Beach and probably also with Murchison, but particularly Dulla Beach at that time. So I can quite easily imagine, discussions over port and cigars. How do you number your fossils? And I'm sure Darwin would be happy to pass on his advice. So following up in a little more detail, these are three specimens, or the labels I've effectively photographed and merged here from three consecutive specimens. And if you look at the numbers, they prove that Darwin's numbers, his pre-printed books, must have gone left to right rather than right to left as the survey one does, because the way they were cut up when they were stuck on, the only way you can do that proves that they ran the numbers ran left to right. So to compare the systems, tickets per book, we used 5,000. Darwin actually was 1,000, I should say. That's wrong, sorry, per book. We printed right to left. Darwin was left to right. 4 digits. Darwin used 3, and then colors. And our system was certainly 1848, 1849 onwards. Darwin's was 32 to 36. So that's the sort of summary of the different systems. Just as an interesting aside, Hooker, Joseph Dalton Hooker, was employed by the survey just for a couple of years to make a collection of representative plants, including thin sections. And you may remember some time back that we hit the news when Howard Falcon Lang found a specimen, a Darwin thin section that had actually been produced at the British Museum from a Darwin specimen, but was in Hooker's collection. And we, although it said on it Darwin Esquire, we hadn't flagged it up on our catalogues as a Darwin specimen. And the reason being that this was actually done, this collection was completed by 1848, and it actually predates our formal introduction of registration numbers. So this was really one of those, we had it in a series of collections known as unregistered. So this was effectively a known unknown. But if you want to follow up, the BGS Earthwise pages have quite a bit on Hooker's slide collection, and they've all been scanned, and you can download them and study them in detail. And just as a quick aside, whilst this prefix and number system was used for the fossils when they were collected and stored for sort of survey study, we used a different system for the specimens actually on display in the museum. So they would have a number put on that corresponded to the position of the tablet in a shelf in a display cabinet on a level within the museum. And these numbers then linked through to the published catalogues that, again, people could buy, walk around the museum and understand. The problem, of course, is that if you number your specimens according to the position where they're on display, whilst it makes it easy if you're walking around the museum, it means every time you redo your displays, you need to, if you move the material around, you need to put another number on it. And we get to the point where some of these have a variety of numbers, and it's difficult sometimes to work out which particular catalogue they refer to. But this was purely for the material on display in the museums, as you see again on these blue tablets. And they've all now, as material is cited in publications, we issue a modern series registration number. GSM is Geological Survey Museum, and it's our main paleo collection. Right, to go on, just one quick example of another connection between the survey and Darwin, and that is in The Origin of the Species, he raises a dilemma that it seems as if with the what we now call the Cambrian explosion, life suddenly appeared, and that there was nothing in the rocks before it. And that didn't fit in with his theories of evolution. And he was looked around, obviously, for examples, potential examples of life before the Cambrian explosion. And one of those that he mentioned in his third edition was this one that Salter had collected in the Longmind. He says the sudden, so the dilemma is, he says, on the sudden appearance of groups of allied species in the lowest known fossiliferous strata, there is an allied difficulty, which is much graver. And the solution to that, as I say, was these fossils from the Longmind. Whoops. So this is Salter and the Longmind material. published in the Fossil Remains of the Cambrian Rocks of the Longwind and North Wales by Salter, 1856. And these are, well, assumed to be traces of burrows. They're paired indentations in bedding planes. And Darwin picks this up and uses it in the 3rd edition as an example of early life that preceded what we now call the Cambrian explosion. If you follow it up with the Darwin correspondence, you can see 1859, he writes to Ramsay, who's then director at the survey, and asks about these organic remains in the Longwind beds. And Ramsay replies that there's no doubt he calls them worm burrows. They're certainly lower than Buran's primordial zone. That's the Cambrian, effectively, in Czechoslovakia. And he also mentions a new discovery in Canada. Well, that turns out to be a mistake, but there's a whole talk in that alone. So to try and pull these disparate strands together, Darwin's collection management and data management procedures, I would say, were really way ahead of his time, and they would still be appropriate 150 years later. So though field slips were not as complete as obviously the survey would do, but his numbering system, his sample registers, his lists, which is now preserved for the rocks, is now preserved in the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. His field notebooks are available, publications, basic data is archived, and that enabled you to reuse it. So I would suggest that Darwin was probably 150 years ahead of his time in terms of his basic record keeping, sample curation, and general data management. Oh, and the question as to why the Beagle didn't sink under the weight of the samples was actually it's answered in a letter from Judd. It says, "My dear Hughes," this is following on from what we talked about at the beginning, trying to justify the case for returning the rock samples from the Museum of Practical Geology to Cambridge. I've been endeavouring to trace the specimens sent home by Charles Darwin during the celebrated voyage of the Beagle. And that's the answer, is that Darwin, of course, did not keep all the specimens on the Beagle. There was actually a very advanced system so that all he would do is pack his samples and his zoological specimens, botanical specimens, into barrels and leave them in ports, as they called in. And there was a system run by the Royal Navy that they would then ship those back to London. And the material then went on to Cambridge, awaiting for Darwin's return. And then he sent it off to the various experts at the time for the detailed taxonomic and study. So the material was never all on the Beagle in one go. It went back as fairly shortly after being collected. And thanks, obviously, to a number of my colleagues who've contributed photographs, and, as I say, the Darwin Correspondence Project and Darwin Online that provided access to a lot of resources. I need to say that I've not done a lot of work on the Darwin's Correspondence Project side of things of late, but it's something that I would like to follow up in more detail in the future. And with that, I would say thank you very much. And any questions?
Thank you very much, Mike. I think you can stop screen sharing. Okay.
I think I have.
Great, marvelous. And thank you, everybody. And we can take some questions, I think, and see what if anybody has any comments or questions. Please, I think the best way to do it is for you to come on screen, take your video off down at the bottom of your toolbar, and we can work from there, I think. Here we go. Any questions, anybody? You'll have to unmute yourself to talk as well. That's the other thing that you will need to do. Just any questions? You've clearly stunned everybody into silence, Mike, with very thorough talk.
Well, can I comment here? What I'm particularly interested in is, of struggling to uncover, is the sort of records of early registration systems. I mean, I know the Cambridge system, for example, I think started under Bertie Brighton, and they introduced a prefix where the prefixes indicate the geological age, and then ascending numbers. And it's interesting too that in Cambridge, they, certainly in terms of the fossils, they number each individual fossil that's considered important, whereas at the survey, we, I think, do the same as Darwin, and that is just number the specimens, the block, rather than the individual items on it. Now, I know the Sedgwick, I think, has changed again and now gone over to a sort of yearly accession system. But I'm struggling to find much on the sort of early, whether there were any controversies about how you record tablets. I'm interested to know, I've no records of what happened in the Museum of Economic Geology, whether they had tablet numbers and what sort of records they kept of the minerals and the rocks and the bricks and tiles and things that were on display. So if anyone does have information on that, I would love to know.
I'm going to bring Brian Rosen in a minute, and Phil James, if you want to speak. Just a thought on that. I'm not sure whether you've looked at the material from Oxford and whether the early collections from Oxford, whether they might also shed some light. In some ways, I can imagine, I don't know their systems well. There are other people who do, of course. But it might be that's another system which might be interesting to look at.
That's a very good point. I've sort of seen some things in passing, but I've not done a full investigation. No, I would need to talk to Eliza and the Oxford team.
Or yes, Danielle is the person to speak to, I think, as well there. That my recollection, and it's maybe very imperfect, I'm actually speaking from Oxford at the moment, but my recollection is that the early specimens were labelled as in terms of descriptive labels, but I'm not sure they had catalogue numbers directly. But at some stage, they will have been introduced, and it is. I think that's an important date to establish as well. So yeah, it might be just something worth doing. Some of these early people who were early in on collecting and what sort of systems that they used. Let me bring in Brian first, and then Phil James. Brian Rosen.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Mike. That's interesting. It's a kind of apostrophe on your talk, but Jill, Darwin and I published a paper on Darwin's collections generally and the trajectory, as we called it, between the actual moment of collecting and the assembly of all the data, not in latter days, but at that time through the notebooks and in the various museums. And in particular, I wanted to mention that the focus of the paper was on a little known, partly rock collection, which is in the Natural History Museum in the Zoology Department. And these were the specimens he collected to illustrate his substance theory of coral reefs. So it's a very small collection, but it was didactic. It was put out for display, we think, at the Geological Society when he gave his talk on coral reefs, which is the first of the trilogies. Of course, the volcanic rocks, volcanic islands is part of that trilogy, and that's the subject. The specimens are, of course, the subject of Mike's talk. But the first of all his books, and the first in the trilogy, is his coral reefs book. And he actually says in there, I collected a series of specimens, so forth, which he explains show the transition from living corals to coral reef rock. So it's a partly geological and partly zoological collection. As I say, it's in the museum, and we've written that up in a paper which I'm afraid is not widely available. As they say, it was a celebration volume, one of the centenaries that Mike referred to, published in an Italian volume, and all the other papers that do with Darwin are all in Italian. So it's a bit of an exotic location for us. But if anybody's interested, it will be, I think it's pretty sure it's on Darwin Online, which again, Mike mentioned, superb resource. And I'm pretty sure we sent it to John Valois, who assembled that. And you can see it there together with an earlier paper I did on coral reef collections and so forth in 1982. So I just wanted to say that there was a very small, significant, but very significant collection of rocks, of reef rock in this case, which we have in the museum. Thanks.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. Many thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Phil James.
Thanks, Duncan. This, rather than being an earth-shattering question, this is just observation, actually. Mike, I love the internal photographs you put up of the Museum of Practical Geology, which I don't think I'd seen before. And isn't it just such a shame that we do not have museums like that anymore? And even what Brian was saying just now about certain things being on display, you know, it's just such a shame, isn't it? We seem to modernize everything, dumb everything down, but the internal shots of that museum are just absolutely glorious. But there we are. I think I live in the past.
Actually, if I could add a rider to that, I totally agree with you. But what amused me slightly, we were looking probably about 15 years ago now, at a time when there was money for agricultural set-aside, starting a geological theme park at Keyworth. It was just an exercise. And that would include a visitor centre. And the idea was to make our collections more available. And they used the consultants that they used at the Eden Project. And I don't know if you're probably aware, if people who visit the Eden Project, that they have their greatest concern is that people will say, you know, holiday makers will say, oh, I've been to the Eden Project, I needn't go again. So they change everything on a very regular basis, which is unfortunate, because I quite like to go back and see how some of the trees and the plants and things that they were in a very early stage when I visited, to see how they've grown over the past few years, but they keep changing everything. And these consultants came up with the idea that they would make a large empty room, a number of meters high, 5-10 meters high, if I remember rightly, blank walls with all the specimens attached. And they came up with an idea that you would go around it on a series of gantries that were hydraulically controlled, and that all the specimens would have numbers or labels on, but not the detail. They would be just numbers, or now, of course, I guess they'd be QR codes, but you would get the explanation would be on screens on these gantries, so that you could go around and see one set of displays, and then they could reprogram it, and you would get entirely different explanations and see entirely different the next time. And if you had, say, a group of foreign visitors, you could do the same in a different language. And if you wanted to do one for school children, you could adjust it according to what year they were and so forth. So it was a really interesting idea, but it was based on everything being on display, and instead of the fixed galleries, going around on these mobile gantries. So when they came up with the idea, I showed them the pictures of the Museum of Practical Geology and said, yeah, I mean, there's no new ideas really. Everything's been thought of before. So I agree with you. It's quite impressive. If anyone is interested, those pictures are on our Geoscenic online photograph catalogue, so you can download sort of reasonable quality versions if you want to use them in talks and so on. It's all there.
The Eden Project roller coaster, I like that. A modern take. How to see systems. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil. Has anybody got any further questions?
Hello. I'd just like to come back to Phil's point about things on display. What I didn't say is that although Darwin put out those specimens, we think, at the Geological Society. They were actually on display in the Natural History Museum until the 1970s, just exactly as he must have laid them out in the first place, with his handwritten captions. There was a small case, so say it's only 20 or so specimens, and it was explanatory, not just a curated collection, as I said, to demonstrate the formation of reef rock, but it was on display in the public galleries for, well, I suppose 100 years or whatever it was, or more. Yes, 100, let's see, 1835 or so through to about 1970.
130.
So it was a remarkable little display. It had no further explanation or curation. It was just there. And I can remember seeing it as a kid and later, and then, of course, came to write it up with Jill. So there's a case in point where we had real specimens on real display and no gee-whizzery at all, just a good old-fashioned exhibit in Darwin's handwriting, which wasn't that legible, so there had to be captions printed which transcribed his captions. Nothing more. There was no further explanation, just transcribed. It was a period piece. We've got photographs, but not of the case itself. I've looked in vain for a photograph of the case itself, but we got everything else. That's all I wanted to say there. Thank you.
And all I can add, Brian, is those were the days.
Yeah, those were the days. Well, everybody says that. Well, if I could sidetrack onto that very point about specimens, I was also a chief advisor for the exhibition in the museum called From the Beginning, which is just what it said on the tin. We started with the solar system and finished up with the Aveley elephants. But the point was we had people tried to specify gee whiz high-tech story, supported story, and it was going to cost an absolute fortune. At that point, we ran out of money because the other bits of the gallery had used up most of the money. We were left with £800,000, and somebody said, "You know what? It would be a lot cheaper to put out a load of specimens," which is duly what we did. So when you go into the museum and you want to see a gallery that's got specimens in it, actually it's not the only one, but we certainly put out there all the specimens we could find to illustrate in that space. Yes, upstairs in the so-called Earth galleries. It's called From the Beginning anyway. So we do have a lot of specimens there, but it was by default, not because of intention.
Marvelous stuff, and it just shows how sometimes I think serendipity works in curious ways.
Yes, indeed.
Are there any other comments? Anything to add? Tim Carter, you've come on screen, but it may be that you just are you wanting to speak? You might have to unmute if you're going to ask a question.
No, I've just come on screen.
Oh, okay.
I thought now's the time to wave a hand and say thank you.
Okay, marvelous. Yes, thank you very much indeed. Well, with that, I think, unless there are further observations and questions about it, one interesting thing, I think I'll just ask Mike. I mean, he scattered some of his specimens across, as you said, across a range of institutions and individuals. It was clearly a specialism. The ones that ended up at the survey, what was it about those specimens that determined to Darwin that he should send them to the survey?
They were, if you download the catalogue from Google Books, as it sort of illustrates and shows, they were to illustrate a display on volcanic islands, effectively oceanic volcanic islands. So it was a suite of specimens, mostly from Ascension, but some from the Galapagos Islands. Right. And it was purely that. It was a relatively small display.
So I'm trying to get the timeline right. Then, his gift or donation of those specimens to the museum would have been in post 1851 or around 1851. So he obviously retained quite a number, as well as giving them out to specialists. Well, although specialists at least retained them, he also he either tried to retrieve them back, so he had as much of his collection, original collection, with him, or I'm just trying to establish exactly what happened to his particular specimens. That's all.
Well, just speculating, I think pretty much all his rock collections certainly were at Down House, and on his death and then his wife's death, it was actually the son, I think, who effectively gave them to the Sedgwick Museum. I believe, but there may be people here who know far more than I do. Darwin, I think, considered himself first and foremost a geologist, and I think he probably intended to do most of the work on the rocks himself, but he then got sidetracked, obviously, with the origin of the species and various other things. So I've no evidence that he sent his rocks to any other specialists at the time. I guess there were not that many other around, whereas clearly on the botany and the entomology and zoology and that, there were obviously a lot of specialists operating. But in terms of geologists, I mean, yes, there were a small number clearly at the main universities and the survey, but that was it. That he didn't have the choice of people to send them to. And I think he thought, as a geologist, he would probably do more work on it himself. So I've no evidence that most of his rocks ever went anywhere other than Cambridge and then London and Down House.
I can support that, Mike. Yes, we looked into that too. Sorry, just in case there was any more reef rock specimens. I think it's some 4,000 specimens, and Cambridge has those and were recently properly recatalogued. I've forgotten the guy's name. He was on some sort of postdoc and worked with the then
Lyle Anderson, probably.
Who was that?
Was it Lyle Anderson?
That's the one. That's the one. Yes.
Yeah.
So so it's all available there, thanks to your work. Sorry, excuse me, at BGS and his work on the Cambridge collections. Unless there's the odd bit and piece that went somewhere else for reference or for go on display for somebody, the bulk of it is in fact in the Sedgwick, just as you say.
I think what was kind of ironic was that at BGS, we've got all Darwin's original numbers on his specimens, at least are clearly visible. We've stuck our labels elsewhere. Whereas in the Sedgwick, they like to obscure the earlier labels by putting the next generation on top.
Ooh.
So when I looked at a lot of Darwin specimens on display, they got Darwin collection in little green donation stickers stuck over, or Sedgwick numbers. So ours, I think, probably show the Darwin numbers better than most of the Sedgwick ones do.
And we've kept ours visible because that's the principle that we keep all the labels through time. However much people leave other tags and other labelings, everything should, in theory at any rate, according to our own procedures, should be visible in the trail box, and which is very good and right. I mean, it's excellent. Yeah. It becomes history in its own right, doesn't it?
In the interests of fairness, I should ask somebody from the Sedgwick to defend themselves, but I'm not sure we've got anybody from Sedgwick here. Sandra Freshen is not here, so I can't do that. Okay. They probably have method in their madness, even though we would probably consider it madness. But however, there we go. Well, that's marvelous. Thank you very much indeed to Mike and everybody else for attending. And I'm going to say that's it for the moment. But I'm going to give out one notice, because this Friday there is an Inhigio webinar, which takes place at 3:00 this afternoon, in the afternoon on Friday, and it's called Coming Out of the Shadows, Women and Geology at Oxford, 1813 to 1914, being given by HOGG member Grace Exley. And I will circulate the web link for those who are interested to attend that. It's 3:00 this Friday. It's an Inhigio webinar. And with that, thanks ever so much indeed. And I'll look forward to seeing people at the next occasion. Incidentally, if you haven't and you're inclined and you haven't yet booked for the Caves, Coves and Controversies field meeting, which takes place in June, just before the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival, then please do book. And I'm sure you'll find it fascinating and very interesting, particularly if we get good weather. It'll be absolutely marvellous. So, without further ado, I shall say thank you very much indeed. and thanks to Mike. And I shall bid everybody good afternoon. Cheerio. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mike. Thanks, Duncan.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye.